Hi, I'm stuck at home currently with a non-COVID virus, and I thought I would record this video that I'd kind of vaguely been meaning to get to eventually. Um, it's kind of on the topic of like, hi, how are you? This is who I am. Here's my background and what I'm involved in and what I'm deeply interested in and passionate about. Um, because things change, and I started being a public professional witch back in 2009. And where are we now? 2022. A lot has changed since then. Like there are things that people talk about now that I don't like, and mainly they're technological and social media based things that I'm like, what is that? It takes me a while to catch up with these things. I'm not on Twitter. I am on Instagram. I am on Facebook. That's it. That's all I can handle. And so, yeah, like I have a new book coming out next year, which has been such a passion project and a deeply personal one. And also, I continue to teach and mentor and divine and work the craft in a variety of ways, both private and semi-public and more public. So I thought I would try to communicate some fundamentals for myself, on behalf of myself. Yeah, so why don't I just get into it? So my name is Theo, and I have kind of recently, well, not kind of, I've definitively recently stepped into weaving both my legal given names, or some of them, and the name that I took on back on the 2nd of May 2013, which is Theo. Both names were given to me by at least my mother. My father was not present for the name giving of Theo, but my mother was, and she cast that circle. And she named me in front of one of my witchcraft mentors at the time, in front of several relatives, actually, who are not in the craft. But yeah, so that name giving was pretty profound as well. So I mainly will go by Theo Gede Parma. I'm aware that not all people will be able to pronounce any of those names, but those are my names. I seem to be fated to have names that are hard to understand by some people. Like often when I say Theo, people go, "Oh, Theo," and I'm like, "No, with an F, F-I-O." Like that I have to do that almost every time. And growing up with the name Gede in Australia, so-called Australia, was also very problematic, difficult, emotionally intense at times. Almost no one knew how to pronounce that name. And then when they would hear the approximate Australian pronunciation of that name, of course, all manner of jokes ensue, because here in Australia, g'day or g'day mate is like a colloquialism. People say it to each other. It's one of the key Australian things. And I hated that. I fucking hated it. And but that was my name, and is the name on several of my books still to this day, although I imagine a lot of people are unaware of how to pronounce that. Technically, it's more G'day rather than G'day, which is super Australian, but try to get white Australians to say that. Anyway, and that's a Balinese name, so maybe I'll start there. I was born in Bali. My father is Balinese, and my mother is a white Australian of Irish and British and Scottish descent. And I was raised mainly in one of the largest inland cities in Australia, which is, maybe it's the second largest, which is Toowoomba, which is spelled Towwomba. A little bit of a chartered song nearly crept back into my mind then. And that is the traditional country of the Yagara, actually no, Jagara in this case, Jaraware and Giabal peoples. And so I was raised with like this form of Hinduism, which is called Balinese Hinduism. Sometimes Balinese people themselves will call it Tata Agama, which is like or agama torta, depending. I've seen it both ways, which is like the sacred way or the wisdom of the holy water, because the torta is deeply, deeply significant and like central to almost all of the rites and workings and ceremonies and kind of cultural pieces to do with Balinese Hinduism. Balinese Hinduism itself obviously is also a syncretic like it's a syncretic ethno-cultural religiosity. So the Hinduism that arises out of Balinese culture is very specific to that island. So yes, there are similarities with other Hinduisms, but there are huge differences. My father is largely like, so there's a form of like a strong main part of Balinese Hinduism is the influence of Shivaic kind of cosmologies and theologies. So the idea that the absolute or the Godhead is Mahadeva or Siwa, as we would say it, and yes, there are other gods or there are other fractals of the divine or whatever. Like there are multiple theologies happening at once, and no one really cares. No one, like people in Bali don't really care, as long as you have some kind of rhythm with the sacred and turn up to the rites of passage and have, you know, are invested in your local community, and you actually, you know, engage and part of mutual reciprocity and obligation, then you're doing the thing, right? So, but I grew up in so-called Toowoomba, and I would go back and forth between Bali and Toowoomba and feel very like I was never of white Australia, obviously. I could never have been, but I was raised by this white, so, you know, seemingly white woman, but who also always made sure that we had these really strong connections to Balinese culture specifically. And so luckily, because there's I guess, a really interesting folk music scene and kind of alternative underground in Toowoomba, because there has to be to stay sane. The Southeast Queensland, the University of Southeast Queensland was home to, for a while, this particular gamelan orchestra, which is like traditional percussive orchestra that comes out of Bali. And so we grew up playing in that gamelan Girijaya. So I grew up going to a lot of folk culture, folk music events and playing at them and doing Balinese dance at them. Like that was really normal part of my childhood and growing up. However, also when I was 11, so this was in the year 1999 and then going into 2000 when I turned 12. In those years, 1999 and 2000, I discovered witchcraft, and I discovered that witchcraft was a like this, like in the Western world, that it was like alive. And I was like, oh, fuck. Well, that's everything I want. Like I identified with it immediately. I was a pretty serious person as a kid. I still have that in me, but because I grew up with animism and spirit work and ancestor veneration and shrines and holy days and transpossession and magic as a thing that could be someone's vocation, I had this strong intuition, and it's consistently remained, that my vocation was to be a witch, and that I was already a witch. I had this strong knowing, but that I had to figure out what that meant and like kind of turn it on, if you will. And so I went fully into it, and I would read anything, even if I thought consciously or preemptively, oh, I won't like this. So I read anything I could get my hands on. I did the things like so often I hear from people who go, I read that book, but I didn't do the exercises. I was one of those people who did all the exercises as much as I could, because a lot of the Northern Hemisphere books prescribe different particular plants and stones even, and herbs that aren't so present in the East Coast of Australia. Weirdly though, I did grow up in a kind of little bubble where, because Toowoomba is like a German British settlement, so-called settlement, I'm doing quotation marks, and so there was a lot, and it's kind of does have a fourfold season thing up there on that mountain. So I did have access to a lot of imported non-native plants. Like there was always oak around. I don't remember seeing a lot of birch growing up, but I remember there was always oak, which was a really strong anchor for me, and continues to be one. And I mean, like, you know, quercus, you know, like British oak. That's what I mean. And so I met, like quite early on, I met pagans and witches and occultists through this thing called Pagans in the Park. Some of you might remember that was a thing. And in 2002, I, at the same time as meeting all of these, you know, older than me pagans, witches, and occultists of various backgrounds, I went, oh, wow, there's a lot going on here. I met this group of, you know, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. That was kind of our age range, 14 to 16, who were all pretty serious about the craft and wanting to be in the craft. And so we formed, out of the ashes of a coven that had preceded our formation, we formed a new coven, which was called Coven of the Spirit Entwined. And for 9 months, I was deeply, deeply involved in that coven. We would spend all our weekends together, and we would do magic and ritual, and, you know, celebrate the festivals and do moons. And we had initiation rites. Like the first, like I have this really strong, beautiful memory of the autumn equinox, which down here happens in March. So this would have been March 2002. So this is when I was 13, but in the year that I turned 14. And this was like, no one else turned up. No one from the old coven turned up to this ritual. So we were like, and we were going to have this like kind of like meeting, and through consensus figure out who were going to be like the high priest and the high priestess, because we were largely working from published Wiccan material. And so it was just me and this other person who, I don't know what their unfolding gender journey is, but we were like, oh, we're like, I guess we're here, so no one else turned up, so we'll do it. So we did the initiation ritual that we planned, and then we blessed each other as the like high priest and high priestess of this teen eclectic Wiccan coven. Like, God's bless our earnest, sincere hearts, but I'm laughing a lot. But also I'm like, I can sense the quickening of the craft kind of from then. And then after that dismal show, I returned to quote unquote solitary practice. I do not like that word. I think that, like, you know, I just don't think you can be, like, witches are always working with their spirits. We are awake to the land, and or ideally, and, you know, and our ancestors and our gods. This is the whole point of it, in my understanding. And so we're never working magic alone, even if we're the only living human present. And so I kind of wandered into the crooked road, and I started gravitating towards, this is during high school, of course, gravitated towards books and essays and online forums that were naming themselves as traditional witchcraft. I didn't really see the term folkloric witchcraft back then a lot, which is kind of now a thing. Like, that term I see a lot now, but I remember people talking about folklore a lot, and like that was really intriguing to me. Suddenly I was like tapping people talking about like regional cultural like folk histories, and like I remember people talking about saints and all kinds of things that are associated with the great complex weave of traditional witchcraft. And I wanted that. Like, I suddenly went, oh, that's what I want. Like, there was lots in the books written by, like, I remember reading Wicca by Vivian Crowley. I read a lot of books by Lois Bourne because the Toowoomba City Library had them. I read books by the Farrers and Doreen Valiente. I remember buying Witchcraft, The Meaning of Witchcraft. I read all of that stuff. And there were pieces in it that I was like, oh, really cool. And I noticed that they were the pieces that were more folkloric or interesting, like historical pieces about the witch trials and things like that. And so I started to meet people who identified as traditional witches, and their rituals, when they would tell me about them, sounded very different to what I was reading. Like, very different paradigm almost. And so I kind of was like, oh, that seems closer to what is happening to me in general. Like, oh, familiar spirits and this kind of wild magic. Almost all my magic. I did have a bedroom altar, and we kept a family shrine, like a Balinese Hindu ancestral shrine in our home, and I would often pray at it. And I had my own altars in my bedroom. But a lot of my magic was done in my backyard. I would like drag the card table out, and I would make the altar under the dark moons and under the full moons. I would invite friends over who weren't exactly into the craft, but who were like, you know, like witchy adjacent, and they would do stuff with me. Blah blah blah. So this is what was happening, and I started to have, as you do when you work magic and you conjure spirits and you like lean in, I started to have experiences. I started to have dreams and visions, and spells were actually reaping the results that I wanted them to reap. And I realized there was something very strong happening for me. And it was very much, I was still really identifying with this calling and vocation to be like fully witch, and just expressing that. And so I started to feel like, especially as I was coming close to graduating from high school, and I knew that I was going to move to the nearest capital city, which is so-called Brisbane, or Mianjin, I realized like I do want to be with a group of people, possibly around my age, like so 18, 19, 20, 21, who are as deeply invested and passionate about witchcraft as me. And so I sent out this email to a bunch of people around that age who I knew to be, from just like talking to them over years on MSN Messenger and on forums online, like really into it. And so we formed, several of us from that email formed Coven of the Wildwood at April 30th, 2006. And so that ended up really, you know, like becoming the center of my craft, because we had established this coven that was like truly working together, like working, like we would see each other all the time. We began to attract interest from people in the area. We started to run public, well, it was first very like kind of semi-public, like if you knew, you knew, but then it became quite public. These open rituals in Roma Street Parklands all the time. And we would run them there was a point where we were running free open stuff in this central location in Brisbane every weekend. We would have like new moon or dark moon, depending what day we wanted. Then we would have a learning circle. Then we would have the full moon. Then we would have a learning circle. And then over time, it became more restricted, especially as an inner court of people who had gone through a particular initiation rite. As that was firmed up and people started asking for training, we were like, oh, okay, shit, well, then we need to close all the learning circles to the people who ask for training. The full moons will be for the community, and the dark moons will be for the inner court of initiates. And that is the basic pattern that happened for that coven and some covens that preceded and branched off that coven, which then went on to, you know, form the Wildwood tradition of witchcraft, which has many roots and many influences, and some of those are like, and cross-pollinations, and some of those are private and some of those are like able to be talked about. So like with any mystery initiatory tradition, there are the in-house stories and pieces of knowledge that also come with admission into the fold, and there's the stuff that you can talk about. But as with the emergence of any witch house, as with the development of any tradition in the modern craft, there is a lot of uncanny business, and there's a lot of relational stuff that you can't write down because it involves private situations between witches and things that are under the rose or sub rosa. And so I was firmly planted and fed by that craft that is named after the Wildwood itself, which is also called the Witch's Forest, or sometimes just the primal place, or that other place, or the other world. But for us, we say the Wildwood. And this, for us, for those of us who feel like we belong to this, there is that like deep sense of intrinsic knowing and belonging, and that's a core part of being a Wildwood witch. Oh, we belong to the Wildwood. And we have a saying that the Wildwood belongs to all witches. So this other world, like primal witch place, it belongs to all witches, but some of us belong to the Wildwood. And so that is at least the mythic strand that pumps so much power into our covenant and our lineages. And at this point, we have initiates in several continents, and there are groups of people and covens. And mainly, I would say that we're mainly a tradition of wanderers at this point, and a wanderer is our term to talk about non-group affiliated initiates. And so certainly you don't have to be in a coven to be a Wildwood witch. However, you do need to be in this context of being a Wildwood tradition, which you do need to be taught by and brought through the rites by someone who has been brought through the rites. So it has that similarity with other traditions. And so around 2010 so in early 2010, 2009. In early 2009, I had 2 books come out, Spirited, Taking Paganism Beyond the Circle, and Crafting the Community, which is like a more like East Coast Australia based and very, very limited to what I had at the time as my community and network, kind of anthology on different reflections of community in pagan community on the East Coast of Australia. Both of those books are out of print as of a few years ago. Actually, you can see my beautiful cover award. Spirited won the cover award that year for best Wicca/pagan book of that year, which I'm very proud of. That book was my attempt at the time. Remember, I wrote this book when I was in my late teens, and it came out in the year that I turned 21. So that book was my like very passionate attempt to kind of take out of the box some preconceived notions or presumptions that some of us as pagans and witches have about our craft inheritance, or even like philosophies or theologies. There's a giant chapter on different theologies in that book, which I'm really proud of still. And different ways of maybe also going about creating community. There's a chapter on that in there as well, and like what it can be like to be a pagan or a witch at school or in your family and things like that. Sometimes when I flip back through that book, I'm like, oh, Theo, look at you. Like you were doing it. You were doing the thing that you wanted to do. Anyway, so like getting published did unlock a level of, like focus and passion. I guess it anchored it for me. And I was like, well, here I go. And so 2009 was the last year I had any other kind of job other than being, a teacher of witchcraft workshops and courses, and tarot reader, and spell casting and rites of passage and all of that, which has been my vocation and professional life ever since. And I've had other books published since then too, some singly through just me and obviously the spirits and traditions that inspire me, and also with my colleague and beloved Jane Meredith. And I guess that's another part of my journey is my fateful meetings with other traditions that I've then been inducted into and trained within and initiated into, which are also really deeply heart spaces for me. I think because of the human I am, and because of my original initiation into the Coven of the Wildwood, that will always feel like what I often will call my home tradition or my heart tradition. Like that is just who and what I am, like the kind of witchcraft I just do, which is ecstatic and sorcerous and mystical, like very mystical and very much based on trance and possession and flight and shapeshifting. Like that is so integral to Wildwood's philosophy and ethos of craft. So that's how I feel. And a dear friend of mine recently said this amazing thing, which was basically like, I can be a reclaiming witch and do Wildwood magic, but I can't always do Wildwood magic and it also be reclaiming magic. And I've totally butchered what they were saying, but essentially Wildwood bleeds through everything else I do. Like I can be really demarcated. For instance, when I teach in reclaiming, I usually don't mention Wildwood. I'm just teaching within reclaiming, and we often or almost always teach with another person in reclaiming. And so that ethos of team teaching or pairs teaching together is super core to reclaiming's feminist and anarchistic ethos, right? And so I can definitely turn up to core classes and turn up at witch camps and just very much be steeped in that reclaiming culture and teach from it and do ritual from it. Certainly I don't suddenly start invoking Wildwood spirits out loud in the middle of a reclaiming ritual, but because of my level of covenant with those spirits, they're also always present with me. So, there is that. So I discovered reclaiming and Anderson fairy, which are intertwined traditions for some, not for all, but definitely reclaiming has a history, has a root within fairy. I discovered them in the same year. So I came to both of the traditions at the same time. So this was in 2010. So I met Jane Meredith at the Church of All Worlds, and I used to, for 3 years, I was actually deeply involved in the Church of All Worlds in Australia. That's all I'll say. And then I met Jane Meredith, and I'd already kind of been fed up with the inner machinations of Church of All Worlds in Australia. And so I just, and I was also deeply involved in my own craft and Wildwood, and a new Wildwood coven I had branched in the Gold Coast, and all of these things, and writing books and traveling and teaching. But then I met Jane Meredith, and as well as Jane Meredith, I had this friend, Abel, and I'd known Abel for years, and we used to talk on MSN, and we'd met on some forum. And I knew that he was involved in reclaiming. And so through Jane Meredith, I applied to teach at the first ever Australian Reclaiming Witch Camp, which was going to happen in the following year in 2011 over Easter. And so I was selected to be a first year student teacher, because there's a particular process. You don't just come in and be a full teacher in the witch camp system. You usually go through these 3 years, and then also there's a lot of peer feedback and stuff like that. And not everyone is suited to witch camp teaching either. Not everyone who starts, not everyone who does the first year of student teaching at a witch camp will continue on. Or maybe they will, but like 5 years later or 10 years later, who knows? So I knew that was going to happen, and I had, basic understanding of reclaiming, but at the same time, I was like, what is happening? Luckily, that team had several, that teaching team had several, truly established, decades practiced in the tradition people to mentor us. And so I was in the Bay Area that year. I had gone to the US to do this book tour for 10 weeks. And I went to stay in SF to meet my friend Abel and to see some relatives, and to teach at a store and blah, blah, blah. And I went to the San Francisco Bay Reclaiming Samhain ritual, which is this huge fucking production, thousands of people. I think that year was 1,500 people. I think I've heard that it has gone up to 2,000 or even more, but it's huge. And it's a profoundly, beautifully held, or it can be, ritual. And it happens every year at Halloween, or as close as possible. And it started in 1979. And that was also the book party and the book release for Starhawk's The Spiral Dance, which is, this really important book in the history of paganism and witchcraft in the so-called West. And it has a lot of influence on a lot of people. And so I was just in this ritual circle of 1,500 people, and we were being led by a group of ensemble priestesses who were so clever and so practiced in the art of ritual, and the art of communication, and the art of theater and drumming and spell weaving and power raising. I was oh, there's something really profound here. And I felt really affirmed in myself. I realized that, oh, I too, I'm not just a Wildwood witch, and I'm also a reclaiming witch. And the thing about reclaiming is it's quite different from other contemporary craft traditions, in that if you are in conversation with the principles of unity, and if you are yes, I'm a reclaiming witch, then you can just say that. You can absolutely say that. Obviously, that comes through maybe a deep dive, an inquiry, meeting a group, going to public rituals, going to a witch camp. Sometimes you chance upon a reclaiming coven because they do exist, and then are just kind of inducted into that coven. I know several people who began their reclaiming journey through realizing they were a reclaiming coven, and things like that, right? So I knew then, and I'd already consented and said yes to being in this teaching team for an Australian reclaiming witch camp. So I was like, I was in. Bam, I was in. And on that same weekend, I traveled to a store in Walnut Creek, and I met Storm Fairy-Wolf, who became my first fairy teacher. At the time, he was one of the only people who was willing to teach long distance, although I definitely know that that was happening beforehand. And this is a controversial topic in the fairy community and maybe other communities. But certainly over the next 7.5 years, so from the end of 2010 to my fairy initiation in July 2018, I was mainly on, sometimes off, studying and training with different teachers. So Storm first, and then another initiate who was part of the Under the Mound, like old fairy community network. And then I kind of realized that fatefully, synchronistically, truly, the person who would bring me through would be, part of the reclaiming fairy family, because there are lineages of fairy that flow through reclaiming. And so that was how I was brought into fairy. And I also did get initiated into the reclaiming tradition, which isn't necessary. And maybe some people don't even know that's a thing, but it is very much a thing. And initiation has been present in reclaiming since before reclaiming was called reclaiming, or at least named a tradition of witchcraft. As far as I'm aware, since 1980, these rituals have been happening in this form, although it has developed since then. And so there are lineages in the sense of who initiated your initiators, who initiated them, and of course they would be traced back to the first covens that developed out of the first core classes. And this is where I would say our lineages come from. And then of course all the influences that poured into those groups, fairy being one of them, Dianic witchcraft definitely being an influence, various other forms of witchcraft that were alive in the Bay were influences, goddess spirituality, feminism, different forms of feminism, different forms of anarchistic organizing, all flowed into what is now reclaiming. And so, yeah, I went through that as well. And I do treasure an initiation that I have in another form of witchcraft as well. I still keep that very alive in my heart, and my relationships with those witches very alive in my heart. And so with all that, different people talk about being multi-traditional or practicing different religions. I remember, I just watched this today. I saw that Thorn Mooney had put up a YouTube video talking about the influences that she has that aren't Wiccan, but went into the fact that she practices multiple systems and traditions, and she was talking about how common that is, and I agree, it's actually quite common. Here in so-called Australia, I think there is this older idea in the pagan community specifically that that's not a thing. But if you're syncretism and practicing multiple things alongside each other, interwoven together, is pretty human, and it's been happening for thousands of years, cross-culturally. And I feel completely a part of each of the traditions that I work within. And when I'm doing ritual and magic alone, you'd be hard pressed to find if I was doing specifically reclaiming or fairy or wildwood ritual. Sometimes there are particular workings in those traditions that are specific to those traditions, and they are done. I do them separately. But when I'm just kind of whipping up the power and getting into it and getting ready to fly, or you know, just blessing some candles or wanting extra space to get to deep dive into a tarot reading, the way that I kind of like approach that or demarcate that working space or step into that ritual space is this like braided Wildwood fairy reclaiming folkloric witchcraft, like or blah 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 way of doing things. And that's what I do. And I say specific things that I've been saying for years that only I say, that are just things that work for me, my little quirks that you would never really hear me say in the context of group workings in any of those other traditions. And so we all have that too. We all have that kind of place we go to when we're the only living human present in the magic, and we'll do specific things that are our secret private magics. And so working in traditions is deeply important for me. It gives me a sense of accountability, structure, lineage, legacy. It keeps me on my toes, because the thing is, like, there's a lot that can happen in a collective body that can't just happen when I'm on my, like, singly, like I'm not an island. So I'm deeply, all the things that I do in my magic are deeply influenced by the traditions that I've been trained within and forged by and initiated into, like deeply influenced. Sometimes I actually have to stop and go, where is this from? Like when I say these words, like where did I get that from? And then I like, you know, and I love these deep dives, and I'll trace it back and I'll be like, oh yeah, I know where that's from. Although there are some things that people that I've heard people say in craft rituals, or like more like maybe pagan rituals, that I still have no idea where they're from. And when I ask my smart friends who know these things, they're also like, I have no idea where they're from. So, you know, who knows? Just some person in a shack somewhere, or sitting in some apartment wrote it, channeled it from the gods, who knows? So yeah, this is kind of who I am and what I do. You can find out lots and lots and lots about the Wildwood and the reclaiming and the Anderson fairy traditions. Sometimes I really wish that Anderson fairy had a different name. I can't just say fairy tradition, because you can't see that I am spelling it F-E-R-I. And yeah, so the Anderson fairy tradition, if you're like, what is that? And does that have to do with the good people? It's like, well, all witchcraft ought to have something to do with the good people. And certainly Anderson Fairy does, but depending on how much that lore is emphasized, depends on the line within that tradition. So there are lines in that tradition in Anderson Fairy that you might never hear information that is in the body of the tradition about these beings. But it would be weird if you didn't as well. It would be weird if you didn't, because certainly both Victor and Cora did speak about various fairy beings, and like one of the big emphases in the tradition is learning your craft, like developing your psychic skills, your spirit working skills, so that you are a good, if not excellent, witch. That you take this work seriously, and that you develop, and that you become a better human through it. Is really the goal, and that you know yourself as divine, and that you are, you know, becoming the god who you are. That's really very much central, at least in my understanding and experience, to the Anderson fairy tradition. So you'll notice that none of the traditions that I'm involved in are part of the British traditional Wicca, or British traditional witchcraft, depending on how you speak that vernacular. Yeah, none of them are part of that group. I have deep love for my witch family, who are Gardnerians and Alexandrians. For sure, there are several people in all of those traditions who practice in those lineages. I, as I said, have read many of those books, and there are many, many compelling, interesting, fascinating contemporary voices that are writing about those traditions. Thorn Mooney is one of them. Now I'm blanking. Like Thorn Mooney is one of them. And yeah, there's just people who, like, I find all craft history utterly fascinating. So therefore, that's why on my shelf I have things like In Search of the New Forest Coven and The Bull of Heaven. And I just ordered a book about by Melissa Symes. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that last name correctly, who keeps a really lovely online archive called, I think it's called the wicca.co.uk, which is super useful for research purposes. And they have also put out a book recently about like the Cardels and the Coven of Utho, which I've always found that section of like witchcraft history very fascinating. So I like ordered that book. I'm very fascinated. That maybe I should say that too. Like if you were to, for the people who come to my classes and courses, whether they're held via Zoom or in person, I tend to be one of those people, and you can find free versions of these things on YouTube, by the way. I tend to be one of those people who mixes a lot of modalities at the same time, right? So it's like, okay, here we are. Let's never stop living sacred lives on sacred land. So let's acknowledge, you know, sacred country. Here we call it country. Let's acknowledge the past and continuing wrongs that the systems and of colonialism and empire continue to inflict on First Nations communities. And let's recognize the power and sovereignty and thriving and law and beauty and power and joy and grief and pain of First Nations communities. Now let's ground, now let's align our souls. Now I'm going to tell you, like, I'm going to kind of take us through the arc of what we're about to do over the next 2 hours or over the next 6 months or over the next 2 days. Now let's do some introduction and context. So that's when I just blah for a while about folklore and history and intersectionality and where different things are coming from and what this word over here I'm using means today, which is central to the whole exploration, and blah, 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 blah. And then we just spend a lot of time doing things like practices and processes and partner work and group work and reflective exercises that help to integrate and anchor what we're learning, so that it's not just a lecture. Like, ooh, I couldn't stand that. Unless the person was a pretty amazing orator, then I'd be into it. Because sometimes you find these people who can just speak and it is magic. Like everything in the room is with it. So, you know, those people are rare, but they exist. And so, you know, that's what I do. That's what I do. That's who I am. What are my fascinations? What are some of the things that I specifically teach? I am probably one of the few people that teaches with like consistent regularity, like transposition intensives. I have a great respect for that, having grown up with that, and it's a core practice of the Wildwood tradition. And certainly aspecting is a very strong thread in reclaiming style aspecting. One can learn a lot from that. And Fairy has, depending on the line, Fairy will have training in and a lot of practice of transpossession or even side possession, which is like Fairy's term for aspecting. So I teach a lot of that, oracular, mediumship, spellcraft, sorcery, flight. Central to my entire craft cosmology is angels, and angels' relationships to the good neighbors and their relationship to the dead and the living. And so I sometimes will teach angelic intensives that are centered in craft texture. And tarot. I'm a tarot reader. I love tarot. I started reading tarot in 2002. When I got my first ever deck as a Yule gift in the middle of that year, and love it. Teach tarot when I can, love it, will learn tarot. I also am like an eternal student. I love taking classes and courses from other people that I respect, or even people who I might not know that well, but I'm just like drawn to their work. So I've taken classes in Kabbalah and tarot and different goddesses and different like the different core classes of reclaiming. One is encouraged to keep taking them, even if you also teach them. God, all kinds of things. Ogham, or sometimes it's pronounced Ogham. Runes. I studied with a beloved one who's based in Chicago, who's a professor in Chicago. I studied the Anglo-Saxon Futhork with him. So also, I love all of this shit so much. So I'm just like constantly like in it, doing it. Like, if you know me personally, you know that I'm a giant nerd about all of it. And I also like I love doing it. I love practicing it. I love being in it. So yeah, craft's kind of my thing. It's probably your thing too if you're watching this. And I just wanted to share a little bit about who I am and what I do. And I'll put below, you can find more out about me. Maybe I'll just put my link tree because it's so seamless and everything's on it. But yeah, if you want to check out my other YouTube videos, there are like 2-hour classes on deity and devotion, on the compass in the craft and circle casting, on alignment of the 3 souls and the 3 cauldrons and the 3 worlds and the 3 ancestors. Like that stuff's on my YouTube channel. So go access it if you like. And yeah, if you would like to tap me for any of my magical services, divinatory services, my website has all of that information. Much love to you at your Beelzebub Tide or Samhain Tide or Hallows Tide or Roodmas Tide, May Tide. That's a really nice one. Peace, praise, and power to you all, and to all the spirits, seen and unseen, known and unknown, who conspire on us, who conspire with us in the work of love, truth, and wisdom.